Conspiracy Unlimited with Richard Syrett.
Welcome to a special video edition of Conspiracy Unlimited. On this episode, explosive new emails published by the New York Post and censored by social media and most major news outlets seem to point to corruption on the part of the Biden family. Now, please take a moment to subscribe and like this channel. Okay, attorney John O'Connor is here to dive deep into these damning Hunter Biden emails. You'll recall that the Ukrainian natural gas firm Burisma hired Hunter Biden for about $50,000 a month while his father was vice president, allegedly because Burisma wanted high-ranking U.S. officials to express support in an effort to shut down investigations against Burisma's owner, Oligarch Kolomoisky. The New York Post recently published these emails, and they say they came from a computer purportedly belonging to Hunter Biden that was dropped off at a Delaware computer repair shop in April 2019 and then never retrieved. Vadim Pozharsky, an advisor to the Burisma board on which Hunter Biden served, for a total of $3.1 million US, emailed Biden and his business associate, Devin Archer, on November 2nd, 2015, with a list of the deliverables he sought from them. Burisma's owner, Nikolai Zlochevsky, was the target of a bribery investigation in the UK at the time. Now, here to discuss all is John O'Connor. He's an experienced trial lawyer practicing law in San Francisco. He's tried cases in state and federal court throughout the country, and he also served as an assistant U.S. attorney in Northern California, representing the United States in both criminal and civil cases. Among his interesting assignments have been representing coach Don Nelson in litigation with Dallas Mavericks owner Mark Cuban, and also representing W. Mark Felt regarding the revelation of his identity as Watergate whistleblower Deep Throat. John is the author of Postgate, How the Washington Post Betrayed Deep Throat, Covered Up Watergate, and began today's partisan advocacy journalism. Hey, John, welcome back. How are you?
How are you, Richard? Good.
So we have to talk about this. It should be a bombshell, but the mainstream media, perhaps not surprisingly, is not covering it. And of course, big tech, Facebook and Twitter, is censoring the distribution of this story. Emails obtained by the New York Post because of a laptop that was inadvertently left at a repair shop in Delaware. We now know, or at least according to the New York Post story, emails on that laptop indicate that an executive with Burisma, this corrupt energy company in Ukraine, this executive got to meet the vice president thanks to Hunter Biden. So, first of all, can you walk us through how the New York Post, in a little more detail, obtained these emails from Hunter's laptop?
Well, apparently the Hunter's computer was water damaged. He took it to a repair shop, forgot all about it. They tried to contact him, nowhere to be seen. So finally, after a bid and their bill not having been paid, the computer becomes their property. And then they ended up, the guy looked at it, and he was shocked by all the emails there, many of them seeming to do with political things and corruption, I suppose. He ended up, don't know if he contacted the FBI first or not. I don't think he got any satisfaction from our wonderful FBI. I wonder what that's about. But he ended up giving the hard drive to Rudy Giuliani, and eventually these things have made it out into the public. There apparently is no issue about whether or not these are the real deal. These are authentic emails that he's got. So there's no issue there. And what it does to me, Richard, it's simply, these emails simply confirm what common sense should have been dictating all along, which is that number one, the vice president was lying abjectly when he said he'd never discussed business with his son, this Burisma. Not only did he discuss it with his son, but he discussed it directly with his son's oligarchic crook clients, with a personal meeting in Washington, D.C. while he's a vice president. To me, that's a lot further down the line than saying I haven't discussed this with my son. I mean, if my son were in the business, I would at least talk with him over the Thanksgiving table about how things are going, son, assuming it was a nice, clean deal. This isn't a clean deal. We all know it. The other thing that these emails seem to suggest is there's some tantalizing clues that father and son have a deal where father gets half of the son's earnings from these things. There was a clue in one personal letter. Then was another deal post 2016 in which the vice president, Hunter was holding a 10% interest in a company for the big guy. So it suggests that in some cases he holds as a trustee certain interests. So the question then rises, Hunter had a 10% interest in this Chinese investment fund that intriguingly he did not become owner of until after the elections in 2017. And he got his 10% interest, which is worth many, many millions, perhaps a few hundred million, if the fund is really $1.5 billion.
And John, that, if I'm not mistaken, that deal with that Chinese investment firm, and Hunter was looking to set up this hedge fund, something like $1.5 billion changed hands. That deal was cobbled together during an official visit to China. Didn't Hunter sort of hitch a ride on Air Force Two for that trip?
Oh, sure. He has hitched, by the way, something like 60 rides over Biden's vice presidency. So it carries with it the imprimatur of the country when you arrive at the vice president and are set to do deals. And bear in mind, our government has fined JP Morgan $290 million, if I've got the figure right, for their habit of hiring the sons of Chinese government officials, because it's well recognized that that's a way to bribe the official by giving favors to the princeling. We just don't have it reversed. Nobody here has thought that, well, maybe our princelings could be the subject of bribery and influence and corruption, which is what we assume in every other country on the globe. So clearly, this was a payment to a princeling. This was at a time when China was militarizing and taking over and building up these islands in the South China Sea, which have tremendous strategic implications, as well as international border implications. Who owns those islands and so forth and so on, but also their military bases. And the issue is, what do we do about it? Do we take this as a provocation and sort of back them off, as often happens in international situations? Well, apparently Joe Biden wasn't rattling any sabers, and of course Obama's not the kind that would rattle a saber at anybody. But you must ask whether we're influenced there. Now, not only does that have to do with our national security, if we get back to Ukraine, Biden is named the point man in Ukraine in early 2014. At that point, Ukraine is a jump ball. Russia wants Ukraine for its strategic importance, for the same reason that NATO and the United States want Ukraine. It is a buffer between the NATO countries and Europe, and also has some pipelines going through it. I think one major one from Russia, which is of strategic importance should there be some sort of a conflict or whatever. It also is a way of controlling the flow of gas and oil to Europe. So this is really important country, always has been, and has always been somewhat subject to being a jump ball. It knows it's worried about the big bear to the north, and it also looks for succor to Europe. So here we are. There's the Euromaidan Revolution, which happened at the end of 2013. Oddly enough, when Paul Manafort's guy, who was the oligarch in charge of the country, Viktor Yanukovych, decided not to sign a deal that Manafort had arranged for him with Europe that would have been very beneficial. Sleaze of Manafort notwithstanding, the fact is Manafort cut a really good deal for Ukraine to be protected by Europe and also to get the benefits of European trade. And this would have been a huge step in normalizing the economy of Ukraine, which is very backward, not modernized, controlled by the old-time oligarchs, remnants of the Soviet Union. Well, I think somehow Yanukovych, who's known to have Russian ties, was somehow persuaded by the good old Vladimir Putin and other people that maybe he shouldn't sign that. So he didn't sign it. It caused a revolt. The people of Ukraine were just fed up with this stuff. And there was the so-called Euromaidan revolution of November 2013 that drove Yanukovych and his buddies out of office. Early 2014, the country is in disarray. President Obama appoints Joe Biden to be the point man in the Ukraine. Now, this is something interestingly enough, as in China and in Afghanistan, Biden raises his hand for it. He volunteers for this. What a good guy. Does he just want extra long, tiring flights overseas to some godforsaken country? Is he really patriotic that he really wants to help Ukraine? What is his motive in raising his hand about Ukraine? Well, sure enough, he goes to Ukraine. And by the way, this is right around the time that Obama allows Putin to come in and seize the Crimea. So now the country is really, really desperate, both militarily and financially. It worries about Russia coming in and taking the rest of eastern Ukraine. Crimea had always been a Russian influenced place, largely Russian population. Historically, Russians had controlled it. There's some case even, I got to say this, for Russia saying this is ours. There had always been a treaty that had Sebastopol.
Right. I think Khrushchev had sort of given control of the Crimea over to Ukraine, but while it was in the sphere of influence of the rest of the Soviet Union, it was never sort of an independent. Correct. And Khrushchev was a Ukrainian. It all made sense, and it's a choke point to the Black Sea. It's very strategic. So here we are. Biden is now the point man, and the key is, everybody agrees, is corruption. You want to get rid of corruption for two reasons. The oligarchs are controlling it, and they're really pro-Russian, and they control things, and you're never going to get control of the country if they have control of it. And number two, maybe should be number one, the oligarchs would retard the advance of economic progress, the modernization of the economy. It would go from a kleptocracy to a true modern democracy, hopefully. So corruption is the key. So what happens? April 14th, just after Biden has been appointed, the joint United States and UK task force in London seizes $23 million that an oligarch is trying to spirit out of Ukraine through London to the wonderful place known as Cyprus, where money goes to die and goes untaxed. So you get your money to Cyprus, you're home free. This money was not a lot of money given the corruption. It was 23 million, but it was highly symbolic. It happened right after Biden gets appointment, right after the Crimean thing. So this is a big symbol. The United States and Britain make a big deal about it. April 29th, 2 weeks after the seizure, Eric Holder, Attorney General of the United States, travels to Europe, has a press conference with Theresa May, then the Home Secretary, later the Prime Minister, I believe. But they say how important it is, how symbolic this is, and by gosh, this is the start of a new dealing, a new horizon, and we're going to fight corruption. Well, what happens to that $23 million? Remember, it was seized on April 14, and all that was needed was a letter from the Ukrainian Prosecutor General
to the British court saying, "Dear British court, send us that money. It's ours. We believe it's the result of corruption," and so forth and so on. Easy deal, you would think. 2 days, Richard, after that April 14th seizure, while the rest of the United States government is merrily pursuing this anti-corruption stuff, lo and behold, Devon Archer meets in the White House for what appears to be over 10 hours because there's no sign out time. He comes there about 2 o'clock and he doesn't leave at midnight. There's no sign out by midnight. But he's there. Now, maybe he slipped out, maybe he just didn't sign out, but he was there. And Devon Archer is the partner of Biden's son, Hunter, and John Kerry's stepson, Christopher Hines, with whom Kerry treats as a son, very close. And Devon is the third partner, and he meets with Biden. So Biden can say, "Gee, I've never talked business with my son." We know that's not true. But he's talking business with his son on a legal matter because your partner is you. If someone talks to my law partner, they're talking to me as a matter of law. So I can't say, "No, I never talked to that person." Well,
right. By now, perhaps we've all seen also the photograph, maybe on Tucker Carlson, of Vice President Biden with Hunter and Mr. Archer holding their golf clubs. So
right.
I'm guessing
they're very close.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
They're very close. And so he knows what's going on. Here's a guy that's so interested in his son's life as this great family man. Well, I think your great family man knows what his kids are doing. Now, this is a little bit deeper than that because obviously, I mean, you have to be a fool not to think that Hunter Biden was trading on his dad's name. Now, I believe that Hunter Biden was hired right around April 18th when apparently the Burisma, this Slakevsky, who is the oligarch whose money went through the bank account. Burisma is his company, and the money came from Burisma. I want to say on April 18th, they made Devon Archer, 2 days after his meeting with Biden, they made him a member of the board. Now, I was always confused because I read in the British papers way back when, the United States papers don't seem to cover it, that also Hunter was named to a post on April 18th. I don't know if that's true. I don't know where they get that information. It makes some intuitive sense. But then we learned that it's not until May 13, bear that date in mind, that Hunter is officially announced to be a member of the board dealing with corporate governance. Now, clearly this stems out of the April 16th meeting, but I was always wondering, why the holdup? Why didn't they announce it right away? Well, actually, these emails answer the question for us, Richard, because one of them says on May 12, and apparently the father, Joe Biden, is on his way winging to Ukraine, and Hunter says something like, "Make sure that the narrative shows our input into it." Now, that's not a good quote, but that's what he's saying, something like, "Make sure that to cast this action as being part of our dealing." In other words, we are sending this guy over Ukraine, okay? And in that same email, he says, "I want at least, I think I should want at least $25K a month." So this is clearly a negotiating time to get pay for his dad's influence. And I'm sure his dad's, one would infer that his dad is in on this and knows what to say and so forth. And the message is received, and they get more than 25K. It's at least 50,000. But the checks that were deposited to the group roughly amount to 83,000 a month for Hunter and 83,000 a month for Archer, which is, really a prorated $1 million a year over 12 months. So it looks like they're getting $1 million a year just for this. Now,
I just wanted to point out for the people not overly familiar with the story, and again, so we have Burisma. This is an oil and gas company. Hunter Biden has absolutely, by his own admission, zero knowledge of this industry. I think he's even indicated that he, in another interview where he was being candid, and I don't know if he was under the influence at the time. He certainly didn't speak to a lawyer, but I didn't speak to a lawyer, obviously, because he admitted that he got the job probably because he was the vice president's son. And
Oh, sure.
and then, so again, these emails that we're talking about that you referenced, we have Vadim Pozharsky. He's, I guess, the number 3 man at Burisma, the number 3 exec, and he is sending an email thanking Hunter for inviting him to Washington and giving him an opportunity to meet your father, the vice president, and spend some time together. It's really an honor and a pleasure, the email reads. And again, that is April the 17th of 2015.
Right.
The second email,
Yeah. Go ahead.
The other email is, sorry, this is an earlier email. Pozharsky reportedly emails Hunter asking for advice on how you could use your influence on the company's behalf.
And what's the date of that one, Richard?
That was May 2014.
Yeah, okay. Okay, that's important because let me tell you what happens. The United States agents, including even FBI agents that we have over in Ukraine, Jim Comey's sent some people over there. They try to get this letter from the prosecutor's office to send back to the court. Now, that email that you just talked about works out very well. Nobody can get a letter out of the prosecutor's office. When people approach the prosecutor's office to get a letter or to talk to the official there about getting this letter, people actually, and I'm not making this up, oftentimes people are absent knowing that somebody's coming. They have been known to flee out the back door and run away when the people come to ask about this. Now, so what happens throughout 14, the letter never comes. So it's like the dog that doesn't bark in Sherlock Holmes. The letter's supposed to come, just a piece of paper, and you get $23 million. Now, why isn't it coming? Now, Biden is the point man, and the person at Burisma is saying, can you use your influence to help? Recently, there's been a report, and I think this explains this particular deal. There's been a report that, at least as to this $23 million seizure, and it may, this bribe that I'm going to talk about may deal with more than the $23 million seizure, and we'll see why. That $7 million bribe was paid, and that's why the letter never came. I don't doubt the $7 million bribe, which is apparently documented, that was paid by Burisma to officials. May have to do with other things as well, that as in addition to the 23 million, because what happens is you have 2 major suits against Burisma that are started up and over time here, and they end up going nowhere. And we'll get into that in a bit. But what I'm saying is, when Hunter is exerting influence, it's more than this $23 million. It's a whole host of things dealing with Burisma, which really should be seized, and I think eventually may have been seized by the government for being corrupt. They had oil leases handed out like candy from the Yanukovych regime, and this Zlochevsky, who was the head of Burisma, one of the heads of Burisma, was Hunter Biden's client, and he's an oligarch. Now, let me say something else, and another owner of Burisma is a guy named Igor Kolomoisky, the most notorious oligarch in Ukraine, known literally to kill people, to take over businesses. He sends thugs in with tire irons. They shoot rubber bullets. They're notoriously fearsome. Kolomoisky is the richest man in Ukraine, and besides Burisma, where he clearly owns oil leases in concert with Burisma, but he also owns the largest bank. Now, here we are, and now, of course, Hunter Biden and Devon Archer represent Kolomoisky too. They're on record trying to get him a visa, and I think they do get him a visa. Now that's when they go to the State Department and all that. During 2014, John Kerry and Joe Biden push hard to get aid for Ukraine, and they get 17.5 billion in IMF funds for Ukraine to put it back up after this Euro-Maiden revolution. And remember, the IMF is largely controlled by the United States. We have the controlling vote, and we probably contribute about 35% to it. So most of that is our money. And we put a lot of guarantees on it, which makes our exposure higher than that. Well, Kolomoisky immediately steals $2 billion. I'm not making it up. He took $2 billion that was deposited directly from the IMF into his bank.
It's the Wild West over there.
What?
It's the Wild West over there.
Wild West. He gets $2 billion directly from the IMF, and it's supposed to be used for loans to help out the energy sector and all this. Well, it immediately goes to shell companies in Cyprus, which is a wonderful spot, into accounts controlled by Privat Bank. That's Kolomoisky's bank. Guess what? The money's never repaid. The contracts that supposedly secure the loans, the sole source of security, are contracts that don't exist with other shell companies. So what we have here is just an out-and-out, and it's been reported, I'm not making this up, it's just an out-and-out theft of about $1.8 billion. Kroll and Company, the famous investigators, KROLL, did a study later on after 2016 and found that Privat Bank looted 5.6 billion, that's with a B, of this 17.5 billion in IMF funds, looted 5.6 itself, and that 97% of its loans were all to interrelated companies owned by Privat Bank or related to Kolomoisky, whatever. And so there was a hole at the end of 2016 of 5.6 billion. That the corruption ended at the end of 2016. Now, Richard, I think you're a man of high intelligence, and maybe you're like a junior Sherlock Holmes. So I just want to test you now, if I can. Can I do that?
All right, let's try.
Something happened at the end of 2016, which led to the fact that Privat Bank was no longer stealing money, and which led to Igor Kolomoisky soon thereafter leaving the country. Do you see any event that might correlate to the end of 2016, beginning of 2017, that might be related to those two events? Here, well, Kolomoisky quits stealing and he leaves the country. What happens?
Well, it might have something to do with Prosecutor General Victor Shokin investigating. This is their equivalent of, I guess, the Attorney General. He starts investigating.
Well, right, and I'll get to that. And what happens, though, is that a certain person named Joe Biden will soon no longer be vice president. Okay, so that's one thing to think about, as being a correlation there. And so Biden leaves, but before he does, and I'm going to back up on some other things you just mentioned, a really nifty thing there. Before he does, he appoints Marie Yovanovitch as the ambassador to Ukraine, who's a Soros-connected person, and she stays on until later on, until Trump gets involved in this impeachment thing. But go back through 2014, there's all this corruption, and there are reports about it that nobody's doing anything about it, even into 2015. And remember, 2015, you have that meeting with the Burisma guys. It was thought, because Obama is so weak militarily in Ukraine, that one of their great Western helps was Igor Kolomoisky. Kolomoisky actually raised his own army in eastern Ukraine, which was the subject of conflict with Russia. And he got a 20,000-man army, mainly of mercenaries, and he actually was doing the United States bidding. And that was sort of the idea was floated that, oh, this Kolomoisky's a great pro-Western hero. and so forth. Well, there eventually was a truce there, and this was between the Russian forces and the Ukraine forces in eastern Ukraine in a place called, I may not be pronouncing it, Dnipropetrovsk, and that's where Kolomoisky's home territory, and that's what he helped the United States with. So that may explain why nobody came after him, but nobody was coming after him, even though they know he was stealing billions of dollars. Now, what happens in 2015? There's a big discussion now after the truce as to what's going to happen to all this corruption. And that's when Biden goes over there. The guy comes over to the United States and talks to Biden. But eventually, another Soros entity is an anti-corruption entity, selectively so. They get on Viktor Shokin for not prosecuting Burisma and not prosecuting Kolomoisky. They wanted to prosecute both of them. Shokin never prosecutes Kolomoisky, but he does at the end of 2015 start making noises like he's going to. And the ambassador, Pyatt, is very strong in telling him, you go after Burisma. I want you to go after Burisma. Now, Burisma is the corrupt oil and gas leasing company, partially owned by Kolomoisky, partially owned by Zelensky. That's right around the time that Biden is going over to Ukraine, and they let the lobbyist associated with Hunter Biden and lobbying for his corrupt clients, Burisma, to sit in on a planning call, a confidential planning call with all the government officials about what they're going to do in Ukraine. That's the Blue Star Consulting. I don't know if you saw that. That was from the emails. So Hunter Biden's got his lobbyist sitting in a planning meeting at a crucial time when the issue is, are we going to go after Burisma or not? Are we going to push this guy? Our State Department is pushing it. What happens? Well, Shokin doesn't go after Kolomoisky's bank, but does go after Burisma. He is persuaded. Biden goes over there and speaks in December, but nonetheless, this guy Shokin goes after Burisma. Well, that's not met with great favor. He raids Zlakevsky's house, grabs documents from it in early February 16 now. And at that point, the lobbyist, Blue Star, and others associated, Hunter Biden himself, they start lobbying the State Department. What are we going to do about this? This is terrible. And I think they start calling Shokin that he's corrupt, that somehow he's corrupt. They're trying to get Shokin off the Burisma case, and guess what happens? Now we come to Richard's point. March of 2016, there's another $1 billion coming in from the United States, and guess what happens? That's when Joe Biden says, you fire Shokin, and he's been bugging them to fire Shokin for a while since his son started lobbying. Joe starts pushing for them to fire Shokin. I wonder if those two things are related. Maybe they are, but a paranoid mind, you would think that. And so finally, of course, Biden famously forces Shokin to be fired by Poroshenko.
And then brags about it at a CFR meeting.
He's admitted it on tape.
That he would not hand over $1 billion in aid unless they fired Shokin.
Okay, now, there's much to talk about, but I want to get to the payoff punch here. By the way, all the cases against Burisma are taken over at that point. Shokin's office no longer has them, even after he's replaced by other people and he's fired. There are 3 pieces of litigation against Burisma, and they all go to something called NABU, which is an American-created corruption bureau, American encouraged corruption bureau that we have staunchly asked them to do so that we can fight corruption. Well, that, of course, is largely controlled. Comey's FBI agent, he's got an FBI station with him. This is supposed to be an American-influenced operation. And what does that American-influenced operation, with Joe Biden as the point man, what does it do? Boy, it sues Burisma in 3 cases, or it takes over 3 cases from Shokin, and then dismisses 2 and settles the other one for $7 million. Now, basically, Burisma gets off scot-free as a result of an American-influenced organization. Now, did Biden have anything to do with that? Well, sure looks like he probably did, given all the facts and circumstances. But here's the more troubling thing. The more troubling thing is that the prosecutor Shokin and his buddy Konstantin Kalimnik, who's an assistant prosecutor, they try to go to the United States to tell their story to the government about this Biden corruption, specifically about Biden. And Marie Yovanovitch won't give him a visa. And then you have this guy that supposedly was an anti-Yanukovych hero, spent several years in jail at the behest of Yanukovych and the Russians. So he's a real patriotic guy named Lutsenko. He eventually becomes the prosecutor, a few prosecutors after Shokin. And he seems like a decent guy. Even Biden said he was a decent guy. And now he's getting all kinds of flack. And Marie Yovanovitch is giving him trouble. And so the whole thing is terrible. And but they cannot. Lutsenko wants his story to be told too. He starts talking to Giuliani. Why can't we investigate Biden for corruption? Now, all of this is going on right around the time that the Mueller report is going on. That's why Giuliani, they cannot get, all these people that are raising their voices cannot get heard by anybody in the State Department. Yovanovitch tells them to go pound sand. They can't get a hold of anybody in the United States. Nobody in the FBI will return a call. And Rod Rosenstein won't return a call, won't do anything about this. There see no evil, hear no evil. That's when they reach out to Rudy Giuliani. And it's right around the time they reach out and Giuliani's getting all this information, which is very useful to him and helpful. And that's right when Poroshenko, who's been the reforming guy in Ukraine, gets defeated at the polls by Zelensky. At this point, the United States government is satisfied that there are anti-corruption measures in place. Remember, it's now been 3 years since Biden's out of office, 2 years since Biden's out of office, and they're satisfied that somebody is doing something about corruption. At least it looks that way.
Now, let me just, John, was Giuliani in Ukraine investigating with the DOJ's blessing?
No, I don't think so. He was a private citizen, but remember, Trump is under the Mueller investigation. He has the right as a lawyer to go out and get information that bears on his client's innocence. And this was part of it because remember, Ukraine, by the way, Ukraine had clearly was found by its own court to have interfered in the United States election corruptly. And that was by a guy named Rosenblatt, who was a Ukrainian parliamentarian, sued. A judge found that he was right, that there was this interference. So there is a reason for Giuliani to go over there and try to get evidence as to what's going on in that part of the world. And he finds all this. Now Zelensky is surprisingly elected. And he is elected in part because of help from Kolomoisky, who owned his television station where Zelensky rose to fame. He was a big supporter of Zelensky, Kolomoisky was, even though he was in exile. Remember, he's in exile now. He's fled. He's afraid of the non-corrupt people that have come in post-Biden, that this thing might actually be so non-corrupt that they're not going to arrest me this time. I got away with it for 2 years, 3 years during the Biden point man time, but now I've got to stay away. Now he's got his own candidate, Zelensky, who's supposed to be more pro-Russian than Poroshenko, and in a stunning upset, Zelensky wins. A lot because of Kolomoisky's support and perhaps even maybe a couple phony ballots over in Dnipropetrovsk or wherever it is. So he wins. Now, what does this mean? The IMF has already, Kolomoisky stole the 5.6 billion, if you remember that. The IMF had to come in and put in 5.5 billion to reflate the bank, to make it solvent again. The government took it over through an honest central banker named, got her name down here, I keep forgetting it, Valerie Gontareva. That's what one of the reasons Kolomoisky fled. Things looked like they were going to be sort of straight as things can be in the Ukraine. I mean, it's still corrupt. So now the IMF is saying, wait a second, we've got Zelensky in here. Kolomoisky has been loud in wanting his bank back. And one of the things the IMF says is, we want to make sure that Zelensky is going to do all the right things and is not going to give in to Kolomoisky. And guess what happens at that time? Right at that time is when Trump makes the correct call to Zelensky. It's an anti-corruption call. And he says, basically he's got talking points from the State Department saying, we want you to talk to Zelensky about rooting out corruption. Trump takes that to its specific form and says, I want an investigation, including an investigation into the Bidens, which would be an investigation into Kolomoisky, Zlochevsky. And this whole foul mess I'm talking about is Biden-centric. And the whole fate of Ukraine depends on it. Because the IMF is saying, we're not going to get back in here and save you guys again unless we're certain that this thing is cleaned up and that Kolomoisky doesn't have any influence. And our ambassador, William Taylor, is saying, now, Zelensky, don't you hang out with Kolomoisky. And the IMF is telling him that. But those threats are empty if, as soon as the president says a peep about corruption, he's impeached. He is impeached with the most absurd theory in the world that investigating someone for corruption amounts to interference in an election, even though he may be a political rival. And this absurd theory is being perpetrated right after the United States has spent 3 years investigating a political rival.
Right. And the president is, after all, he is the chief law enforcement officer in the United States, even over the DOJ, right? He's the number one law enforcement officer in the United States.
Right, and he has two hats on. He's the number one law enforcement officer, and he's also the commander-in-chief and head of national security. And as head of national security, he has no bounds. The legislature shouldn't have anything to do with national security, his role, nor should the judges, who normally abstain from these things. If Franklin Roosevelt decides he wants to do something in World War II, he can do it. Okay.
Trump was accused of in this phone call of conducting this quid pro quo, which is exactly what Biden was doing when he threatened to withhold $1 billion unless Shokin was fired. And so it seems that Trump was impeached for doing what Biden was doing, in fact, and then he was investigated for 3.5 years for doing something that Hillary was responsible for.
Right. Well, the quid pro quo thing, first of all, there's nothing wrong with the quid pro quo. That's what the Marshall Plan's all about. We've been doing it for years with the communist-controlled countries during the Cold War. We'll give you foreign aid if you tilt toward us, if you do this, if you do that. So the quid pro quo thing is perfectly fine. The difference is Biden did a quid pro quo for a corrupt purpose to the extent that what Trump did was quidish pro quo-ish. It wasn't an explicit quid pro quo. It's something like that. It was an influencing action request. It was for a non-corrupt purpose. It was to clean up corruption, and it's what he should do as commander-in-chief, and which the IMF was urging, and which, believe it or not, has a profound impact on our national security. Because if Ukraine topples to government influence by Russian government influence, that has serious implications for both energy security and for just general national security. Now, let me give you the bottom line. The result here is that as all this is in the offing, Kolomoisky, for some reason, after Zelensky's elected, he feels comfortable coming back to the country. Isn't that interesting? And it looks like he's acknowledged he's met with Zelensky about doing business again in Ukraine. And the question is Zelensky going to go one way or the other? Well, our wonderful media has not pointed this out, all these problems. And then by impeaching Trump, Zelensky and Kolomoisky have tremendous cover. And Zelensky has lost his ability to deal with Kolomoisky and to give him a stiff arm. Because if he could say to Kolomoisky, look, I got this problem. If we're going to get millions and billions from the IMF in the United States, I got to stay away from you. And by the way, I can't give you back Privat Bank. We got to kind of do this the right way. If he's protected against the guy who breaks people's kneecaps and shoots rubber bullets at him, that would be a good thing. Now, let me just tell you, meanwhile, Kolomoisky's trying to get his bank back. And just to tell you what a good guy he is, and this may be related to him or not, but remember Valerie Gontareva, who seized his bank as the central banker in Ukraine. Mysteriously, her house in Ukraine burned. Isn't that interesting? And she was smart enough to live in London now. And my gosh, her family member's car was burned. How many times do you get your car burned, especially in London? It just was burned. And she was walking one day and trying to be a pedestrian, and a car came and hit her and injured her. So that's just Valerie Gontareva. Now, that's just a little taste of Igor Kolomoisky. And remember, Hunter Biden represents Igor Kolomoisky.
John, we're just about out of time here. I just wanted to ask you very quickly. As equally as big a story, arguably, would be the way that these emails, these Hunter Biden emails, have been suppressed and censored by big tech. Do you see, and Ted Cruz is finally saying, now we're going to do something about it, finally. Do you see anything happening here in regards to breaking up Facebook or Twitter?
Well, I would not want to be them at this point. I think they've gone so far in suppressing free speech that they may run into trouble. The problem is they've been so successful in suppressing free speech, including suppressing the fact that we're about to elect a demented crook. And Hunter's going to come back into the clover very soon here. And if you think that it's all bets are off now in Ukraine. By the way, Kolomoisky has said that Ukraine is now going to go to Russian influence. There's no doubt about that. So he's already said that, and so that battle is over, because he knows that he's not going to get any more goodies from the West because he's back in power. So he might as well now that he's looted the West, he might as well go back to Russian oligarch stuff. But all of this is caused by a dishonest media, and I will tell you this: the tech companies are probably betting that Biden wins, because if Biden wins, they're going to be protected. So now what do common, normal Americans who want a straight up political system and want a straight up media system, what do we do about it? I don't know. If the three branches of government are all controlled, or at least the two houses and the executive branch are controlled by Democrats, I think you're going to probably see more suppression of speech. I would like to see the only remedy is by speaking out, by people like you and Ted Cruz and people like you who have some audiences, speaking out as vociferously as you can about the suppression of speech. It's been my bit for a long time, Richard, as you know. Everything flows from suppression of speech. You can get away with murder if you fool people. And Abraham Lincoln said it, you can fool some of the people all the time. He was a trial lawyer. And that's what's happening now. These guys are trying to fool some of the people all the time, and all the people some of the time. And it's working. Unfortunately, it is working. And I don't think you're going to find 2% of the people of this country know who Igor Kolomoisky is. And I don't think you're going to find 5% of the people. Well, maybe I'm wrong on that. Maybe there's 30% of the people realize that Hunter Biden's, ethically challenged. Now, how many people understand that Joe Biden is profiting from his son and is directly in league with his son. That is the big story. We are now just about to get a president who, through corruption, has endangered our national security and is about to get elected again. He's endangered it with China. He's endangered it with the Ukraine/Russia bit. So both East and West are two major enemies. Biden has sold out to them, and I don't think he has the mental wherewithal to withstand any pressures anyway that are going to come up from these folks. He's not going to be the kind of guy that's going to push to fight them. And meanwhile, his son's on their payroll. His son is invested in a $1.5 billion deal with the Bank of China. My son's in that business. I know how it works. And if you've got an easy customer, you can charge them 2% on the capital. That's what is that? 300 million a year? I don't know, 2% is of 1.5 billion. Plus you get profits if you make over a benchmark. If you make over 6%, you get 20% of that. I mean, and then he owns 10% of that. That might be worth a couple $100 million that he got from China. And if his dad owns half of it, as we suspect he does, what does that mean? Is he going to go rough on the Chinese? Now, what about Ukraine? You got Kolomoisky that's got billions. And how much is he feeding? We don't know, for instance, how much went from Kolomoisky and those guys to the Boies Schiller law firm, which Hunter was associated with, and they hired him. We know nothing about how much money he's really got. So we have a president who's bought and paid for through the son, through the princeling. Got a president of the United States, if he's elected, that will be bought and paid for by our two worst enemies. And the press is not saying anything about it. The major media is not saying anything about it. I don't think I'm crazy. I don't think I'm a far-right loony. As a matter of fact, I think I'm a former federal prosecutor who cares about these things. I've looked at this. I study this stuff deeply. I read the papers. I watch the news shows, and I'm just stunned at the lack of communication. And as the Post says, democracy dies in darkness, Richard.
Well, it should be a nonpartisan issue, to be sure. And people, if they can find it online, they can read the New York Post article for themselves about these emails. And I'm sure Rudy Giuliani will have more as well to say about this. And he has a podcast, and I'm sure he has more documents ready to go. So hopefully the message will get out so that people can make, again, nonpartisan, they can make their decision on who to vote for based on all of the information. And then, of course, there's the big tech issue suppressing this information, which is related, but kind of a separate issue that has to be dealt with as well. John, Postgate, available at postgatebook.com. And thank you so much for all your diligent work.
Well, Richard, this is good. It's an important subject to bring up, and I'm happy you took the time to discuss it.
All the best. We'll talk again soon.
Take care.